All right, I'm really, really excited to jump into this. So we kind of want to talk about story. And Gabe, maybe start with a bit of your story, how this came to be, and then we'll get into the broader idea of story.
Yeah, so I'll give you a quick recap of my life that took me to a real inflection point in my journey in 2015. So grew up in a Christian home, came to know the Lord personally when I was 14 years old. Ended up going to West Point, went into the military. I was an infantry officer for about 8 years. Went to combat in Iraq in 2003, 2004. Been married at this point for 24 years. So Janet and I started dating when I was at the academy, and so she was with me throughout that the whole journey of the Army and combat and all those things. And we took a big vocational turn by leaving the Army, went to seminary, and then ended up going as missionaries to South Africa. And we had this dream to start basically a disciple-making community in the Cape Town area. And so our daughter Madeline was 5 at the time. I think I was 33. I remember when I turned 33, my brother was like, Jesus was finishing his ministry. What have you done? And so, but right in the middle of life, I think, when you're in the middle of life, especially in your 30s, that's the season where, you want to make your mark in the world. You want to make your life count. You've gotten your education and you've had some experiences, and now you're like, man, I'm ready to go do something. Mm-hmm. And I remember being at that point. And so we set off on this big adventure. Madeline was 5. I'm, right in the mid 30s. And so we get to Cape Town and we build this community, and it was beautiful. But really, it came from this deep desire that, I wanted to know how to be a disciple, and then I really wanted other people to be able to experience that too. And if I'm looking back, because we understand life as we look backwards, right? Looking back, I think I see that I think I experienced a lot of disappointment just up until that point in my journey in the church, and I wasn't experiencing relationships at the depth that I wanted to. And so we built this Christian community in Cape Town with a deep desire to figure out how to follow Jesus in a radical way.
Was that a desire that was there, speaking of looking back, all growing up, or did it kind of hit you at some point in that early 30s stage?
Yeah, so interesting. It hit me when I was in seminary. So I went, for those listening, don't know what seminary is. It's a master's program for people who want to be pastors. So you're basically, you're studying theology, which is the study of the knowledge of God. And it's a long program. It took me over 5 years to complete. And so, you're deep in the Hebrew scriptures, you're deep in the New Testament scriptures. And, I had to learn the original languages of Hebrew and Greek. I mean, it was really intense, level of studying the Bible. And I remember getting to my last year, and I'm getting ready to be, a professional Christian. And I know all these things, and I can read text in different languages, and I can teach and I can preach and all this stuff. And I remember I was in a class, we were reading the Gospel of Matthew in the original Greek, and we get to Matthew 28, which is, I like to call it the final command, from the King. It's right when Jesus is getting ready to ascend into heaven, and he gives this final command to his disciples, and he says, go and make disciples and teach them everything I've taught you. And I remember reading that, because one of the things when you're reading something in a different language, it slows you down. And I remember it slowing me down.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it does. I had a professor that he was my Hebrew professor, and he would do his morning devotions in Hebrew. And I thought, why does he do that? And that's what he told me. He's it slows me down.
I never thought of that. Yeah.
So anyway, I was really slowed down in those verses in Matthew 28. And what hit me was, man, I'm super well educated. I'm about to be a professional Christian as a pastor. I have no idea what it means to disciple someone. This seems like maybe the most important text in the entire Bible, because this is the last thing that Jesus tells us that our lives ought to be about. And I'm reading it and going, how do I do that?
Yeah.
and it was kind of terrifying.
Yeah. So it's more than what you know.
More than what you know. Yeah, for sure.
And what we'll get into in this series is a lot of, I think, for me, a misunderstanding of that command for many years. And so it actually felt really burdensome. And I think what this experience gave for me is, no, that command is actually really freeing and really exciting. And so I'm excited to get into that too. But anyway, continue on.
Yeah. Yeah, this is I should never start a story. This is going to be the short version. It
won't be.
Version. Yeah, but Ron, to your point, I mean that's right. I think so much, growing up in the church, I think if I did have a concept of what it meant to follow Jesus, it was, learning things. It was memorizing the Bible. It was understanding theology. It was having the right answers. It was be able to engage people who, weren't Christians with their questions and things like that. But it seemed like that those verses are really inviting us into something different than that, some other kind of journey. And so that's where I became curious about, like, what does it mean to make a disciple?
Mm-hmm.
How do you do that?
Mm-hmm.
And that was really the quest, right? That we set off going to South Africa to figure out. So we did it, and we were in that. We arrived in 2012, and so we did that for several years. And it was, I think in every way that you can measure ministry, it was a successful enterprise. It was a growing ministry. I think people were learning how to follow the Lord. And we reached a point where I decided, we don't want to create our own content to teach people. I just want to find, great content and invite people into it. And so I started exploring, who's doing great work in the realm of, like, discipleship, but really, like, understanding that as a journey that you go on. And, I always kind of had the framework of head, heart, hands, just when it comes to developing people, that those are the three main realms. We can, like you alluded to, you can develop someone in their knowledge, in their head. You can develop people in their hands, like their, the practical work that you do. But then there's this heart piece, is like, how do you help somebody grow at the level of their heart, of their soul, the core of their being? And that's the part that really tripped me up. And so we, through a series of relational connections, found two guys that were doing the work of helping people become disciples of Jesus at the heart level through the lens of story. And so we invited them to come and do it was a week-long retreat with our community in South Africa. And that's the place that this whole journey really began.
That's really cool. Even though I know you pretty well, there's parts of that story that I didn't know, and it's neat to see how it connected together.
Yeah, and I can continue that story a little bit, Steve. So we do this retreat, and everybody engages it really well. People are, like, learning in a new way. This idea that we can understand that God has a story, that we have stories, that we can talk about those with each other. And it was really fantastic. And we get to the end of this retreat, and these two guys that were leading it said, "Hey, we want to take you for coffee." And they were getting ready to go to the airport. So I was like, "It's great. Well, on the way to the airport, we'll go." And so we have coffee, and I thought we were just going to talk about how great my ministry was and how awesome things went at this retreat. And, but what they said was actually, like, really shocked me. They said, "Hey, we see that, like, you're leading a significant ministry and you're very gifted and smart. And, but we also see that, like, there's something in you that's preventing you from really engaging your own story." And this is language I learned later, but what they saw was that I was posing in my life.
Mm-hmm.
I knew the right things to say. I knew how to, like, build organizations. I knew how to lead people. I was knowledgeable, so I could teach things. But when it came to me being vulnerable, me sharing my story, what they saw was I couldn't do it. There was something blocking that. that work from happening. And so what they said was, they said, hey, like, we have an offer for you. They said, we want to come back in 3 weeks time. And they were from the United States. And this is Cape Town, South Africa, which is like a 16-hour flight from Atlanta to Johannesburg, one of the longest flights in the world. They said, in 3 weeks time, we want to come back at our own expense, and we want to spend a week with just you. And we want to help you like begin to get at, what is your story?
Huh. Is this like a type of work they had been doing for a long time, or how did it seems like to me, having grown up in the church, but in a certain flavor of it, I'm like, where did these people come from? Like, I came into contact with it originally through Dallas Willard, if you know who that is.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, where were these people all my life? Like, to me, it's this weird, it almost seemed like some side thread of Christianity. And now I'm like, oh no, I think this is kind of just people tapped into some of the main core stuff. But were they also doing that kind of story lens?
Yeah. Yeah, they were, they both had ministry backgrounds. They both led, ministry overseas in different contexts, and had themselves kind of hit a wall, where they had, you have to have a crisis moment. I think most of the time you have to have a crisis moment before you change.
Yeah.
Right. Life's all about pain management. If things are going really well, like, you're not going to change because change is difficult. But like, when you hit a wall and life isn't working out and your strategies aren't working out and something's massively going wrong, like that's when, you change. And both of these guys had a really big experience, in ministry and life, painful moment that led them into this work of exploring, like, this really central question is, who am I? What's my real identity?
Yeah.
So I'm curious, because a lot of these guys listening will have just been invited into this process, this journey, Iron Collective, in the group format. But do you remember at all when you got invited into that by these two guys for a week?
Yeah. Like,
as you sat with that question for 3 weeks and that invitation, what was going through your mind?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ron. I like literally had no idea what to expect, and what I remember like being equal parts like curious and terrified.
Yeah, that's good.
Because they said literally, I was like, what do I need to do to prepare? Because in the way I'm built, like, what can I do? Like, how can I like arm myself?
How can I defend off the intervention that's going to happen?
Right,
yeah. Like, no, that's why we're here.
What books do I need to read?
Yeah, how can I be really successful in whatever it is we're going to do?
Sure.
And show up in a way that's impressive.
Yep.
And so, but I was curious because they didn't tell me much. They literally, they wouldn't answer any of my questions. I remember I kept emailing, like, what can I do? What can I read? And they would just write back and say, did you rent the Airbnb? They rent a really good Airbnb and like block your calendar, and they're like, literally, that's it. And yeah, so I was nervous and not knowing. And I remember I rented this place in our favorite little seaside village in South Africa. And we get to this house. It was wintertime. We built a massive fire, and we're sitting there, we get the chairs all lined up, and there's this moment where it's like, okay, this is it. And I'm wondering, like, I don't even know what they're going to do. Like, what's going to happen? And they were literally like, all right, Gabe, tell us your story. And we had 5 days in front of us. And I remember my first line was, well, I was raised in a good Christian home.
There you go.
And I remember the one guy, Gary, who ended up being like one of the most, significant figures, mentors, in that period of my life. He was leaned over and he said, "I'm sorry, I have to stop you right there." He said, and I'm not gonna. He cursed, so I don't want to say that on the podcast. But he said that's rubbish.
Yeah,
and he said, and basically it was like he took me through a line of questioning. It was like, well, were your parents humans? I was like, well, yeah. And he said, like, do you believe that humans are inherently sinful? I was like, yes. He said, well, how long did you live with your parents? I was like, 17 years. He said, so in 17 years, your parents who were sinful never sinned against you? I was like, oh, man, I've never thought about that.
Yeah.
And then when it began to uncover, and I won't go on into all of it now, but I didn't think I had a story to tell, really. Especially not from my childhood, certainly. I just had this, I thought, benign childhood. And what I began to uncover in that week was that, and we'll get into this later in the podcast, but that evil had been pursuing me since the day I was born. And, that there was things that happened, and I learned a way of showing up and being in the world that caused me to be disconnected from my true self, disconnected from people, and disconnected from God himself. And that though I was a Christian, though I was well-versed in the scriptures, that I was a pastor serving in a significant ministry, is that I really did not know who I really was. And I couldn't really tell you the true story that had happened to me.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, that's probably a good place to maybe let's talk about the idea of story and like what is story, and introducing that at a deeper level.
Yeah. Yeah. So story, I'll give a caveat up front that I was an English major. I went to West Point. I was terrible at math. And so I picked a major where you didn't have to do math. So I was an English major. I was actually art, philosophy, and literature major, to be exact. And so I've always loved sort of the idea or the lens of story. I love reading stories. I love writing stories, and I think story is like this very like nuanced way of telling truth, because that's what art is, right? Art is telling truth with a slant, because the real truth of things is brutal most of the time, especially when it comes to people. So story is this artistic way of describing people and relationships, and all the many nuances that are involved in understanding identity and understanding like relational connection. And so, it's no wonder then that God chooses to reveal himself through story. And by the way, that wasn't something that I figured out quickly either. I went all the way through seminary and didn't understand that the Bible is one cohesive story beginning to end. Genesis to Revelation, it's one story. And the story is telling us who God is. It's his story.
Right.
And because he created everything, it's also the true story of the world. And it's the only story that's big enough to tell us who we are too. And so God has a bigger story, but then each of us has a smaller story that we've lived. And, we're a character in our own story.
And I think what I heard you say earlier is we often miss both of those stories, right? Like we often miss our own story.
Yeah.
We don't think we have one, or we don't think it's worth telling.
Yeah.
But we also miss God's story because sometimes we're so wrapped up in our own world, and that we miss what God's doing outside of us and outside of, our own little spheres of influence.
No, that's exactly it. That's exactly right. We get like micro focused in on like our story is the story, and forget this bigger, or maybe we don't even know. Like maybe we've never heard there's a bigger context, because it's a sad thing, really. If my story is all there is, boy, the world's a pretty small place.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. In our Iron Collective group, Gabe, one time you said this, I kind of wrote it down because the quote really stuck with me, but you said understanding who God is and his story is really important, because our view of who God is allows us to correctly interpret everything else.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah. Who do you think God is? Like what is his character? And it's one thing to say, well, God's loving. It's a different thing to tell a story about what that looks like. And that's the beauty of the scriptures, is that it's not just like God is love. That's it. There's your maxim for life.
Right.
Yeah.
That's true, but not powerful. But, when you read the story of, God putting flesh on and entering into our world, and, sitting at the tomb of his friend and weeping, you're like, man, the heart of God is so compassionate and so kind, and you see that in this real story with real people.
Mm-hmm.
And so then that informs who we are too.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, this may sound silly to some people, but I know from my kind of faith background, which is similar to a lot of people in America right now, kind of thinking about trying to step back and think about all this. It's almost like you hear the story idea and you're like, oh, that's a cute side thing. Like the main thing is the gospel and the gospel. And even like that word, I think we need to dive into what that means. But it's like the main thing is the gospel. And then like story is a cool, cute side thing. But what I hear from you over and over, and what I've come to see, is that it's actually the main thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know your thoughts on that, because to me that was actually an important understanding of story as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think like this, I mean, we could go way back in history, right? Like this is, but our whole Western world is profoundly shaped by, the Enlightenment, by rationalism, you know, by this, by really the notion that like you are what you think. Descartes, I think, therefore I am, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, but that's not the complete truth. And I think we sense that. We sense that we have to be more than ideas. But most people, I don't think, have like a framework for understanding more than that. And I think story is the way that God gives us to understand ourselves, to understand himself, and understand other people. There's someone once said, people are not problems to be solved, but holy mysteries to be uncovered. Mm-hmm. And people are so complicated. And if you've been around people in any like form of depth of relationship, that, right? Like I've been married 24 years, and I think Janet, my wife, would say I'm very much a mystery to her, still figuring me out. And same is true for her.
Well, and we're going to get more into that later, I think, the mystery of people. But I'll just say, as a guy, I mean, my first step is typically I got to solve a problem, and whether it's work related or people related, like that's always my first thing is I got to fix this,
right?
Instead of really working to peel back the layers and understand more of their story and who that person is.
That's right.
Yeah, which bleeds into our faith, right? And so many guys express this or realize this, that they're approaching Jesus in the same way. It's like, well, this is like a checklist of things I got to solve, things I got to do, versus a relationship is actually about relating. And I think this idea of story helps get us there, of relating with God in the day-to-day, not just making Christianity a checklist that's also part of our job we got to get done.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really takes us to like, what is the Iron Collective, and it was really born out of, this of my story, that I had this story of encountering these friends who invited me on a journey to understand who I really was, and gave me this framework of like, wait a second, you have a story, man. You have things have happened to you that deeply, profoundly have shaped you, and I couldn't name any of them or talk about them or have language to talk about that. And they started to give me that language. But what that led to, that work started in 2015, and by 2016, I reached a crisis point in my life because, what happened was all of the brokenness of my life that I had, and we're wired different ways and we manage pain in different ways. But, my way of managing the pain in my life was to shove it down, ignore it, because I really learned that in my childhood. And then I learned that even more in the Army.
Mm-hmm.
And, this idea that, men suck it up and drive on.
Yeah.
If I had a tagline for life up to that point,
sure.
And that's how I had lived. And so I had all this pain of things that happened to me in my life, in childhood and in combat, and loss that I had experienced. And I had never talked about it, never acknowledged it, or how it had shaped me until that point. And so I reached a point of crisis, actually, and realized that the work that I needed to do to understand what had happened to me, and to really understand, one of you mentioned the gospel, which just means good news. And it's like, what is the good news? It's the good news that like we need to memorize Bible verses, or
Great
what
news.
great
Wow,
news. You
cool.
need to go to church a lot.
Do
you
more
know?
work. Yeah.
No, the good news is that like God came for you and made a way for you to be restored. At every level of your brokenness, he made a way for you to be restored. And to experience that restoration, though, you have to be able to name the brokenness.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I think I had up until that point just named God loves me and his grace is enough. And
because that's often all it's presented as.
yeah. And so I'm a Christian, and so I'm good, right? Like one time I was a bad human, and then I met Jesus.
That
and
is,
now,
right. There's the storyline, right?
There's the story, which, by the way, like this has become something like a tagline for me lately in life and leadership, is that like we have to reject simple stories.
Yeah.
And because I think we love simple stories. I know I do.
Well, there's part of the pressure. Well, I was bad, now I'm good, so I got to keep looking good, or else that story is false. So now we put pressure on ourselves to be good. It's like now we're missing the whole idea of having a actual relationship with God.
That's right. So
I heard some of this stuff early on. I'm like, well, yeah, that's cool. Like that's what you do in counseling. That's like cool therapy stuff to like visit your past and work through those, how you were wounded and stuff. Cool, awesome. But no, that's actually part of the core tenet Jesus laid out of how you can get into a relationship with God and be healed and be like with him every day, not just like one time.
Yes.
And so it really is a core thing to the gospel.
It is, because to understand, our healing, we have to understand our woundedness first, right? I mean, it's just like any physical wound. You have to like look at your physical wound and pay attention to it and go, man, I have a giant gash on my arm, to before I stitch it up. And it's the same way with our souls. So I hit this wall, and in 2017 ended up making a decision. We made a decision as a family to come back from our ministry in South Africa. And there's a lot of complexity, of course, in that story. But a huge part of it was, I had begun this journey of doing this work of understanding my own story. And Janet had begun that work too. And we realized that the context that we were in, leading a stressful ministry in a different country, like we weren't going to be able to do that work in a meaningful way in that space. And so we came back to the United States. Fast forward, kept doing that working. By the way, you can't do this sort of work alone. And that's what we're getting into.
Uh-huh.
You have to journey with others. This isn't like it's me and Jesus and a cup of coffee kind of work. This is, I need people to be with me, and you need a guide, but you need others to walk with you in this. And so I had that. And so really from 2017 to 2020, continued that journey of healing, of understanding myself, of understanding really for the first time God's grace and love for me, and beginning to experience freedom in my life for the first time. And then COVID hit and the world shut down. I don't know what that was like for you guys, but as an extrovert, it was like super painful. And I was like, man, how am I going to manage? How am I going to continue this journey? And so I actually invited you guys to be in a group. We lived in, at that time, 3 different cities, and there was a couple other guys that we invited as well. And we started the first Iron Collective group. And really that was born out of my desire to continue to journey with others in a meaningful way. And you guys were a big part of that journey from 2020 onward.
We were the victims, let's be honest.
That's right.
It was, I remember our first conversation. I think I was talking to you, Gabe, one time. I was like, I just really been craving like a group of guys, like, describing a certain thing. And you were like, well, I've got a product offer for you.
And it's on Zoom.
Yeah. And it's on Zoom, but I had no idea what I was getting into, right? It was just like, you should show up to this thing and be cool. And then
Well, and I think it's the power of the invitation, right? And I think when you know someone who's inviting you into something and you trust that person, as we did you go, hey, I'm going to try it. I'm going to take a leap of faith here and see what it's about. And I'll say for myself, I was hesitant on the inside of like, I don't know what this thing is. It's not a Bible study. It's not a group that I'm used to. I mean, as a seminary grad too, it's not knowledge based. So that's scary to step into, because it's actually a lot harder, when you begin to unpack your own story and look back and ask those questions, I mean, that can uncover a lot of past hurt that you would rather not revisit, you know?
Ron, for you, what was, when you said it was more difficult, to enter into that kind of group than just like studying or something? Like what made that difficult for you?
Well, I mean, I think it's what you said, I wanted to show up prepared. I wanted to have the right answers. I wanted to have my mask on, which we'll get to later. And I didn't know these other guys that I was going to be journeying with. I knew you, and that was it. But I think it was that stepping into it and going, hey, I'm going to engage this process, and I know I need it too. By the way, I needed community and didn't have it at the time, and so. Yeah, it was that, the fear of the unknown. But I think too, as we got into it was more than what I ever thought it could be. Because I had experienced pieces of that community through campus ministries and other parts of my story of discipleship, but not in a long time. And so that was huge for me to go back to that place of really journeying together with other guys and then doing the hard work of like, wow, what's God doing in my life? What has he done? What is he continuing to do? And where do I fit into his story?
Yeah. Wow.
That's
cool. That was beautiful to be a part of your journey in that way too.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Ron. I mean, I think if all the guys in that group were sitting here, we could all tell a similar story of how that was really impactful to us. It makes me so excited for anyone listening to this and the experience they're about to have or maybe are in the midst of.
Yeah. Can you share a little bit about just some of the tools that we use with story? One in particular is box talk, which I think is fascinating because, for these guys on listening to this podcast, they're about to step into this process, and they may be listening right now and go, I have no idea what my story is. I never thought about it. I don't have a story, or, it's not big and exciting. But what you shared with us was like, here's a tool to actually take some key moments through box talk.
Yeah. So it's just a form of storytelling, because storytelling is a foreign discipline for most of us. And it's daunting, right? If I said, hey, like, tell me your whole story, like, where do I start? How do I do that? And so I totally stole this from another ministry. I can't remember who. So if you're listening to this and you made the box talk, like, just know you did good work.
Yeah.
The idea is this, that you go find 3 objects. I'll give an example in a minute, but 3 objects that represent 3 parts of your story, of your journey through life. And then what you do is you literally put them in a shoebox. That's the idea. That's where the name comes from, though we might call it the Ziploc bag talk, because I put mine in a gallon Ziploc bag. But you put it in a box or a bag, and then you bring it to your meeting, and then each guy takes turns telling their story through the box talk. And so you literally it's easy because you pull out each object and you just tell the story of like, here's, so for example, mine is, I use a coin that my grandfather gave me. I tell that story. I have a piece of an artillery shell from the Army that I use to tell part of the story. And then I've used different things. You can use a picture of my time in South Africa, or I've even used my wedding ring. So you can use, really, there's no right answer. It's just 3 objects.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say I love that process as one who went through it, for the first time a couple years ago, and just going like, what are 3 objects that represent 3 kind of key moments in my story? And it was hard, it was hard to distill it down, but also super rewarding on the back end to take those things to the group and share a little bit of my story and tie them to my objects. So mine were a pocket knife. I had a Clemson lapel pen, and then a writing pen as well. And it actually flowed really well. Yeah. And, for those of you who are listening who are like, I don't know what mine would be, I mean, get the wheels turning now, and ask your family, ask your spouse, because they'll have some ideas too.
Yeah. And just recognizing there's different personalities in a group is important, because some people will feel, I remember, Gabe, when you shared those 3 objects and shared your story with us, I was a little frozen because I'm kind of someone who can overthink, or like I'm a big picture thinker. So I was like, oh my gosh, what are my objects going to be? I got to nail this, and it felt paralyzing in the moment because I didn't know what my objects were. I didn't know my story yet. And you encouraged us, actually. I don't know, maybe it was me. One of us said that we were unsure what we were going to pick. And you just encouraged us that, yeah, it takes some time. Sometimes it takes some reps even, or just straight up time and discussion to start to discover your story. So don't feel like, well, I got to nail this and I got to know my stuff right at the beginning.
Yeah. And there's no right answer. Your story is complicated, and this is only a piece of it, And by the way, this is a great exercise for like any group of people that you're trying to get to know.
Mm-hmm.
I've done this in like business settings before, church settings, with my own family.
Yeah.
Like if you're just looking for a tool to help a group of people get to know each other, this is a great little exercise.
Mm-hmm. Gabe, maybe just wrap us up on the idea of story.
Yeah, I would just say, like, I'm just getting excited sitting here thinking about everybody listening that has the opportunity to really begin to engage their story and really begin to engage God's story, because that is the place where we find life. So I'm thrilled for all of you listening that are going to begin that journey. Why is story so significant? If you don't remember anything else, remember this, that story is always a sacred place. Why is it sacred? Well, to be sacred is to be set apart for a distinct, worthy, holy purpose. And a story is sacred and set apart because it's the place where God has been at work. And it's acknowledging this is holy ground where God has been at work in a person's life. And when we engage in the work of helping someone else uncover the mystery of their story, what we're really helping them uncover is seeing, maybe for the first time, this is where God showed up in your life, even when you didn't know it. And that's where we begin to come alive. And that's where we begin to understand who God really is, not at a theological level, but at a heart level of, man, this is how God has showed up for me and shaped me. And it's an invitation to begin to understand where he's still showing up in that way. And that's where we find life. And that's why this work of engaging story in a group like this is so incredibly important and powerful.